This is a series of discussions on Carl Jung's book, The Undiscovered Self, which is a great introduction to Jung's political thought and Jung's views on how political ideologies relate to religion. And last time we talked, we'd gotten through most of the second chapter, which is entitled Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness, which right away gives you a pretty good idea of what the chapter is about. But towards the end of the chapter, he makes the statement that religion is, for human beings, instinctual, it's uniquely human, and it's universal, meaning that there never was a time and place when people didn't try to pursue some spirituality, and usually in a ritualized fashion of some kind. And yet in the modern world, which is kind of like a blip on the radar screen as far as the time that people have been on the planet. In the modern world, he points out, it's been criticized by rationalists as, quote, magic and superstition. And in modernity, then, there's been a trend towards atheism brought about by an increasingly scientific point of view, a scientific outlook on life that Jung seems to think is appropriate in certain areas, but doesn't do well in others, and one of those areas is psychology. Now, it's interesting because he didn't want to abandon the concept of science as far as what he was doing. He claimed that what he was doing was scientific, but he expanded the definition of what science meant to be able to encompass his own psychological methods, which by today's social scientific standards would not be scientific because they wouldn't have to do with quantification and chemistry and things like that. Basically, in this chapter, he says, we shouldn't discount magic. Magic is a thing in the human mind, in life, and it serves a purpose. He says magic has, above all, a psychological effect whose importance should not be underestimated. The performance of a magical action gives the person concerned a feeling of security, which is absolutely essential for carrying out a decision, because a decision is inevitably somewhat one-sided and is therefore rightly felt to be a risk. So Jung would say, even in the modern world, people believe in magic, but as we've already seen, they place those belief in magic and those magical expectations and feelings onto worldly figures, leaders, ideologies, programs, this and that, science itself. And as though these things can perform some act that will save them. But that is not a type of magic which makes themselves feel more confident in themselves and their ability to do things themselves, but puts all of the burden and weight onto the ideology, the leaders, the government, the movements. And that leaves the individual basically even more defenseless. So you see, Jung seems to be saying here, if magic is done right, which it turns out is in a religious context, in a genuine religion, when magic is done right, it actually gives the individual this ground of security and a certain amount of certainty and comfort in the world that is necessary for that person to be able to act in a world that is inevitably very uncertain, where you have to make decisions, where there is always going to be risk involved. That religion helps people to do that and to be able to get on with conducting their lives and taking responsibility for themselves. That's a great deal of the reason why Jung prefers a sincere, genuine religion having to do with spirituality rather than a secular political religion. The secular political religion, a mass movement of some kind, it diminishes the individual and makes him very small and insecure and dependent. And that's the opposite of the effect that he wants out of genuine religion. So the state can take advantage of humans' religious instinct but it cannot perform the same psychological effect for the individual. And that's because religion's goals are otherworldly. They're this worldly too, but there's this otherworldly dimension that the state does not address. He says religion's goals are deliverance from evil. And, like from the secular state's perspective, there is no evil, there's just ignorance. But deliverance from evil, reconciliation with God, and rewards in the hereafter. He says these are not the kind of goals that the state has, such goals as just distribution of property and universal prosperity. One of the greatest lines in this chapter coming towards the end is that the value of community depends on the spiritual and moral stature of the individuals composing it. So Jung is not arguing against community, but he's saying that unless you have true individuals, and that means not individualists in the sense of, me, pay attention to me, only I count, but people who know who they are comfortable in their own skin, are capable of standing up for what they believe in, even when a large group of people disagree with them, even when the state is against them if necessary. You have to have those kinds of individuals who are able to think for themselves and act independently before you can have a true community. I like that. It makes a lot of sense. You either have community or you have the mass, right? The community is capable then of true political action where people face each other, deliberate with each other, actually try to come up with solutions to help each other. The mass gets pulled along, gets moved by emotion. It throws all of its support onto a leader or a political party or ideology, and can be, can have very different effects. All right, so enough of that chapter. And then in chapter 3 is entitled The Position of the West on the Question of Religion. Basically, this is a chapter about how is the West doing in Jung's view. If religion is that important, that it's, really important to keep people truly independent, how is the West doing? And remember, this was written during the time of the Cold War, so he starts off by reminding people the Soviet Union is this huge threat. And, what can the West do to counter this threat? And he says, well, obviously, based upon what I've already said, that it ought to counter that secular religion of communism with an equally potent, he says, faith of a different and non-materialistic kind that is needed to defend against the so-called danger of psychic infection. There he's referring to the danger of becoming a sort of mass, just like what happened in the Soviet Union, at least theoretically. So how is the West doing? Well, he says not only does the West lack a uniform faith that could block the progress of a fanatical ideology, but as the father of Marxist philosophy, it makes use of exactly the same spiritual assumptions, the same arguments and aims. This also is a very important point because lots of people have taken Carl Jung to be very critical of communism, which he was, but as somehow pro-Western or pro-capitalist, which he was not. What he's saying here is the West spawned Marxism. Karl Marx was a German. Communism as an ideology emerged from the West, and it's materialistic. It's about economic growth. It's about technical advances, increasing scientific discoveries and achievements. All of those goals are the same as the goals of the capitalist West. Both of them are materialistic. He says the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc. So scientific rationalism and statistical leveling are two qualities of the West that the West shares with Soviet communism. Remember, he's complained a lot about how in modern, political economies, when people are treated like statistics, they are dehumanized. And that happens in the West through, for one thing, big government and big government regulation and law, but also through the economy. More and more, as people are being marketed to and sold to, and also employed in positions that do not allow them creativity, they get treated like statistics too. Now, if people understood this at the time, a lot of people would have been offended by this suggestion. But this is the same suggestion that Alexander Solzhenitsyn made in his famous Harvard speech that I did a couple of videos about a while back. A Soviet dissident comes to America and basically says, well, this is somewhat better than where I came from at the moment, but however, you guys lack spiritual depth. You guys have problems with materialism and a certain type of selfish individualism, and that's not good either. Jung ends that particular thought saying that the West's goals are practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal, because when you think about it, what's the promise? That through the growth of the economy, we'll all someday, have a great standard of living, that it will, expand so much that, there will be no more poverty, and everybody will have more than what they need. Maybe Marx would have to agree that the Western democracies have done this better than certainly Soviet communism ever did. So he goes on to echo some thoughts of Jacques Ellul, who's another philosopher whom I've done a series of videos on. Ellul wrote The Technological Society. Well, Jung kind of channels Ellul here in a way. I think actually Jung came before Ellul. I don't know, I'd have to check their dates. Anyway, he says, in reality, quote, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the war technique that is supposed to safeguard his physical existence. His spiritual and moral freedom, though guaranteed within limits in one half of his world, that's the West, is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half, the East, it's abolished altogether. So in neither the West or the East does he truly have spiritual and moral freedom at this point. And that is because, in Ellul's phraseology, technique or technical rationality, scientific rationalism, however you want to put it, has taken over too much of people's lives. And a very telling point in this particular paragraph is we have created this war technique, this war machine that now threatens our very existence. So our advances are truly a double-edged sword, and one that could end up doing, and has ended up doing, much more harm than good. Now, how are churches doing in the West in countering this insidious, creeping technological takeover of our lives and our mentality? He says Western churches are not doing so well. And it's interesting how he takes this apart. He says that Western churches promote beliefs and creeds. And creeds are, sets of beliefs. I believe in God, the Father, and so on and so forth. So they're good at promoting, here's the things that we believe, and here's what you need to believe in order to be a Christian or in order to be saved, etc. But he says what they're not good at is actually giving people direct inner experience. And he says the type of faith that just involves sort of latching onto a creed and professing a creed is a very fragile and easily destroyed faith, because as soon as somebody can come along and say, well, I can prove that didn't happen the way you all say it happened. I can cast doubt on this particular tenet in your creed. If everything's resting upon a sort of faith in these tenets, then once that doubt enters in, it easily can crumble. Well, you can imagine now, like if a person has direct experience, that's a different type of thing. He actually says that what people call faith is not really faith. He says people call the true religious experience, people call faith the true religious experience, but they don't stop to think that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place, which instilled trust and loyalty into us. If you say that you have faith in a person, usually you would say that because that person has consistently, done what he said he was going to do, has consistently been there, has never, given up on you, has never, fundamentally let you down. And so with that experience, you have faith in that person when one day they're not there when they said they would be. And you say to yourself, well, you know what? I know that person. And I know it's because something must have happened, some legitimate thing must have happened to prevent him. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. That's the type of faith, okay? I use that as an example because we've all had these types of experiences. But basically, he's saying there is the possibility of having direct inner experience, and I don't think it's probably the type of enthusiasm of an evangelical dimension necessarily, although, the evangelical churches are one of the few places where people strive to have that type of experience. It does tend to be kind of emotional and collective, though. Like I put this big mega church picture here for a reason, because they tend to be large. Their spiritual experiences are kind of very collective. When you go away, and disperse, go back to normal life. Jung praises Catholicism in this regard. He seems to think Catholicism at his time anyway was a little bit more likely to provide people with the means to have this inner experience. But I'm not sure either one of those two, maybe especially in our own times, are some sort of ideal. And he doesn't pin down exactly where you would go to get this. This is something that probably every person has to try to figure out for themselves. But he does have a point that if you have direct experience, the creeds don't matter as much. And if a chink gets cut into the armor of the creed, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have the faith because you've had this experience, whatever it may be. So he thinks that the Western churches have, in a way, become also rationalistic, too much about doctrine and dogma and arguments and fiddling around with those kinds of things, rather than really facilitating direct spiritual experiences. And he seems to think that if there was less literalism, because literalism in the Christian religion, he says, it's an expansion of the point he makes about creeds. When you think about, say, you must believe every word of the Bible is literally true, there are so many ways that literalism can be disproven with the contradictions within the sacred texts. Scientific facts that contradict them, and so on and so forth. Now, this is scary territory for almost everybody, but Jung indicates that understanding biblical stories and articles of faith symbolically would, for modern people whose minds are in a different place than people several hundred years ago even, that will open the window to an inner experience. Now, it's important to understand that when Jung says inner experience, a lot of us today think, well, he's talking about psychological, as though religion is just some sort of psychological thing. In a way, yes, he is, but you have to understand, for Jung, the psychological was not less than the external world. There was a huge and very undiscovered territory within the psyche, an amazing thing that was so rich and amazingly miraculous that it would be just as difficult to figure out and discover all the secrets of the human psyche as it was to figure out all the secrets of the universe. So the idea that it's not real if you experience it within the psyche, that's the idea he wants to crash down. So I understand, like, people are concerned, and so am I, about, what effect psychological perspective on faith does to faith, because it seems to diminish it to, oh, it's just a projection of our mind. But when you look at it the way Jung does, the mind is the gateway to things much greater than the individual. Truly, the collective unconscious, which goes way back into the mists of time, into very primal experiences of both a physical and a spiritual nature, a very direct relationship to the natural world, which people used to experience as full of God or full of gods. So anyway, we have to try to see this through Jung's perspective, and for him, the psyche was not a diminishment. It wasn't the lesser reality, it was the greater reality and the true mystery. So, building on that, chapter 4 is entitled The Individual's Understanding of Himself. He once again makes the point that the individual psyche is an exception to the statistical rule. Each individual is different from every other individual. And he says the psyche is robbed of one of its main characteristics when it is subjected to statistical evaluation. He then says churches grant the psyche validity only insofar as it acknowledges their dogmas. In other words, when it surrenders to their collective category. Well, apparently churches aren't any good from this perspective if they try to make everybody be and believe exactly the same and not to actually seek direct experience. Then he goes into the archetypes. By the way, this is a picture of a mandala that Jung himself made that you can find in his famous Red Book. He says the foundation of the human psyche are the archetypal forms which are grounded on the instincts. And the human instincts come from way back. He has a sort of quasi-evolutionary view of this, but going back to the very first humans, whenever that happened and people became differentiated from the animal kingdom by their level of understanding, by their ability to communicate with each other at a crude level and so on, these experiences created in them appropriate instincts, but as they developed, those instincts were more than just about the basics of food and survival and sex and things like this, but went far beyond this to, how to grapple with and relate to the incredible and often frightening and destructive and mysterious world. So those instincts had to do with how to deal with mystery, how to deal with darkness of and fear and sublimity, the frightening, amazing character of a world that could feed you one day and burn your entire world down to the ground the next day. He says these archetypal forms that are developed in the human psyche are passed on somehow from generation to generation, and they become these categories in the mind. And because human beings are much more sophisticated, and they can think about the past, present, and future, and they can communicate verbally, and they can make artwork and so on, people manifest these archetypes, these ineradicable forms, in various ways, right? So they come out as a goddess in one culture and a god in the other, or they're symbolized by an animal here and by a different animal there. In us, he says, they have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. Now, what he means by numinous is there's a feeling that within you, and maybe even external to you, there is something unknown and larger, and it has a psychic charge to it that is out of your control. Doesn't feel like it's of your own making, because it really isn't, because the collective unconscious is not under our control, just as instincts are not under our control. And that's frightening, because people want to be in control. So this is why they can arouse fear. And this is why people develop rather intricate religions to handle the archetypes, to handle the numinous experience, so that it becomes somewhat controllable. He says that the archetypes cannot be understood intellectually, but only experientially. This is why the creedal religions and the literalists don't give people a proper path to actual faith. But if we don't come to grips with the collective unconscious, with the archetypes, with that numinous quality somehow, then we remain afraid. Remember at the beginning of this talk, religion is that which, genuine religion is that which allows you to go through life with less fear and with more certainty, and to be able to make decisions. If we can't do that, if we remain in fear, then it impedes self-knowledge, and we cannot have that independence that we need. So he ends this chapter saying, or near the end, he says, "It is the specific task of psychology to provide just this knowledge and understanding. It would also be the task of the confessor, zealous in the cure of souls." He's talking about a priest or a minister there. "Were it not that his office inevitably obliges him to apply the yardstick of his denominational bias at the critical moment. As a result, the individual's right to exist as such is cut short by a collective prejudice." So, Jung is really frustrated here. He said this in many ways over and over again in this chapter. He wishes that the confessor, the priest, the minister, the rabbi, the mullah, these religious figures would actually, be engaged in the cure of souls by helping people to have genuine inner experience of God or gods. But instead, the task falls to psychology, which I almost think he doesn't think would be a profession if the religions could and did do their jobs correctly. It's interesting. So it's fallen to psychology to fill in that void. And what he's doing is he's calling upon religion to, more or less what he's going to do is call upon religion to tap into the insights of analytical psychology, his particular brand of psychology, in order to update themselves to meet the people where they're at, with all their doubts, with all their kind of inability to believe in very specific literal things, such as, absolutely rigid creeds, right? Or biblical literalism, and to meet them in the mysterious inquiry they happen to be living. Good psychology, he argues, helps the individual acknowledge and deal with his inner darkness and the wild forces inside him, and it helps him to become a true individual instead of a conformist. That's the political value. All right, so next time we will move on through probably several more chapters. Don't know if I'll quite get done with this, but it'll be one or two more. All right, hope you enjoyed this. Bye.